Donald Trump has done it again. In a move that stunned economists and ignited global headlines, the former and possibly future president of the United States signed an executive order slapping a sweeping 35% tariff on Canadian imports. His aides were caught off guard. Markets tumbled, and millions of Americans felt a sudden jolt at the grocery store, the gas station, and in their paychecks. But what Trump may not have anticipated is that Canada holds a secret weapon, one not made of steel or oil, but dirt. Pink dirt, rich with a mineral so crucial it keeps the entire global food supply chain alive. It's called potash. Here's the jaw-dropper. Canada produces 38% of the world's potash supply. The United States barely registers. In 2024, America consumed over 5 million metric tons of potash but produced less than 400,000. That's not just a gap, that's dependency. And now, with Trump's tariff detonated, Canada suddenly holds all the cards. If Ottawa restricts exports even slightly, fertilizer prices in the U.S. could explode overnight. And the first to suffer American farmers, the very base that voted Trump into power. From Iowa cornfields to Georgia peanut farms, the red states that fueled his rise could be the first to burn. This isn't just economic pain, it's political suicide. Because in the war for global dominance, it's not about who yells loudest. It's about who controls the dirt. That's happening now isn't a trade war, it's a global realignment. And while the U.S. plays defense with tariffs, Canada is redrawing the map of its future. The first LNG shipment has already left British Columbia for Asia, beating the long-delayed Alaska project by years. Export corridors are shifting. Potash shipments are quietly being rerouted. And a once U.S.-dependent supply chain is being rebuilt without Washington at the center. The ripple effect is terrifying. Fertilizer shortages in the U.S. trigger a spike in global prices. Farmers in Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia, already struggling with climate shocks and inflation, now face catastrophic supply gaps. Crop yields fall, food security crumbles, and what began as a nationalist trade gesture turns into a humanitarian crisis. And who takes the first hit? American farmers, the very people Trump claims to protect. In red state counties, fertilizer prices jump 40%, planting schedules collapse, and supermarket shelves reflect the chaos. Canada never fired a shot. It didn't need to. By merely withholding a resource the U.S. took for granted, Ottawa proved that dependence is the real vulnerability. This isn't just economic pressure, it's strategic revenge disguised as logistics. This was never just about tariffs. It was about trust and the unraveling of a trade relationship that once defined North America. While Trump storms the media with bombast and nationalism, Mark Carney is quietly rewriting Canada's destiny. New pipelines, Asian contracts, steel laws, export corridors, all built without needing U.S. approval. And that's the danger, not Canada's retaliation, but its independence. Because tariffs only hurt when your partner has nowhere else to go. But Carney is building exits fast. Every LNG tanker that bypasses American ports, every ton of potash sent to India instead of Indiana, chips away at the illusion of U.S. dominance. So, what now? The U.S. may remain powerful, but it's no longer untouchable. And Trump's latest executive order may not be remembered as a show of strength, but as the moment America began bleeding influence through 1,000 quiet cuts. Is this the rebirth of American resilience or the beginning of its isolation? Let us know in the comments. Share this video. Subscribe for more untold geopolitical stories. Because while the headlines scream about conflict, the real revolutions, the ones that shift power, often begin in silence. In 2025, former President Donald Trump signed an executive order imposing a sweeping 35% tariff on Canadian imports. His administration framed this move as a step toward protecting American economic interests. However, The consequences extended far beyond a typical trade dispute. The decision triggered a chain of economic and geopolitical responses that exposed the fragility of American supply chains and the underestimated strategic strength of Canada. This episode offers a clear lesson on how power in the global economy is shifting, not through loud confrontations, but through quiet structural transformation. The most critical element in this trade war was not steel or oil, but a mineral called potash. Potash is essential for producing fertilizer, which is necessary for sustaining modern agriculture. Without it, crop yields drop, food prices rise, and food security becomes unstable. Canada supplies 38% of the world's potash. In contrast, the United States produces less than 10% of what it consumes. This imbalance created a dangerous point of dependency that Canada could exploit simply by reducing its exports. Prime Minister Mark Carney did not respond to Trump's tariff with inflammatory rhetoric or matching tariffs. Instead, he adopted a strategic and structural response. His administration paused Canada's digital services tax to de-escalate tensions diplomatically, while quietly preparing to reduce potash exports to the United States. This move signaled a shift in strategy. Canada was no longer reacting emotionally or politically. Instead, it was using economic leverage with surgical precision. Carney's approach extended beyond potash. When the U.S. imposed a 50% tariff on Canadian steel, Canada did not retaliate directly. Instead, it rewrote its procurement laws to require Canadian steel in all government-funded projects. This policy redirected domestic demand inward and protected key industries without escalating the trade dispute. The government backed this shift with over $1 billion in infrastructure investments, retraining programs, and financial support for workers and communities impacted by the loss of U.S. contracts. Energy exports also became a tool of strategic realignment. For decades, over 97% of Canada's oil and gas exports went to the United States. That began to change. Canada's first liquefied natural gas LNG shipment to Asia marked the beginning of a new trade pattern. Asia represents over 70% of global LNG demand, and Canada's geographic proximity to the Pacific makes it a more efficient exporter than the United States. As the U.S. struggled with delays in the Alaska LNG project, Canada was already delivering fuel to Asian markets. The broader impact of these shifts was significant. Reduced potash exports from Canada increased fertilizer prices in the United States by an estimated 40%, particularly affecting Midwestern and Southern farmers. These regions represent the core of Trump's political base. As production costs rose, profit margins narrowed, and supply chains came under stress, many American farmers faced economic insecurity. This outcome revealed the unintended domestic cost of unilateral tariff policies. The consequences were not limited to North America. Global potash prices also rose. Developing countries in Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia faced disruptions in agricultural planning, leading to fears of lower crop yields and rising food insecurity. The ripple effects demonstrated how a bilateral trade policy could create multilateral instability in essential sectors such as agriculture. This moment exposed a deeper truth about global power. Strategic strength no longer comes only from dominance. It increasingly depends on flexibility, resilience, and the ability to adapt supply chains to shifting global conditions. Canada's response was not to fight back in the same way, but to reduce its vulnerability to American pressure by building trade corridors, diversifying export partners, and increasing domestic investment. The lesson for the United States is that economic coercion can generate short-term headlines but long-term damage. When a major economy uses tariffs against a close ally, it signals unpredictability. This undermines trust and encourages trading partners to seek alternatives. Canada's actions show that even smaller economies can effectively protect their interests by focusing on policy coherence and long-term planning. Canada's structural realignment included more than just economic adjustments. It reflected a shift in mindset. For decades, Canada had relied on low-friction trade with the U.S. as a central pillar of its economic strategy. Trump's tariffs forced a reassessment of that dependence. Rather than retaliate emotionally, Canada chose to insulate itself against future shocks by diversifying its trade relationships and asserting greater control over critical industries. At the same time, other U.S. allies observed these events with caution. Europe has already begun to pursue strategic independence in areas like energy and minerals. Japan and South Korea have expanded LNG partnerships with multiple suppliers. Mexico is investing in Pacific trade routes that avoid U.S. choke points. As the United States continues to use tariffs as a tool of pressure, its trading partners are responding not with confrontation but with realignment. The United States retains enormous global influence. However, that influence now depends more on reliability and cooperation than on force. The Trump administration's tariff strategy may have projected strength in the short term, but it weakened the very alliances that support American economic leadership in the long run. In contrast, Canada's response exemplifies a different form of power, quiet, deliberate, and adaptive. By leveraging existing dependencies and building alternatives, Canada turned a moment of pressure into an opportunity for renewal. This case illustrates that strategic patience and domestic investment can be more effective than confrontation in defending national interests. The 2025 trade confrontation between the U.S. and Canada is not simply a story of tariffs. It is a lesson in modern economic diplomacy. In a world where supply chains cross borders and interdependence is the norm, the ability to adapt matters more than the ability to threaten. Canada adapted, and in doing so it proved that power no longer needs to roar to be real. Canada's measured response to Trump's aggressive tariff escalation also reflects a broader principle of economic maturity. Instead of reacting impulsively to a political provocation, the Canadian government focused on insulating its domestic economy and reducing its exposure to geopolitical risks. This strategy did not seek to punish the United States, but rather to limit the potential for future disruption. The steel procurement law, for example, was not merely a retaliatory tactic. It marked a permanent change in how Canada approaches industrial sovereignty. By mandating the use of domestic steel in federally funded infrastructure, Canada ensured that critical national projects would not be vulnerable to international supply chain shocks. At the same time, the federal investment in job retraining and community support demonstrated a commitment to social stability, preventing economic shocks from becoming social crises. Similarly, the redirection of LNG exports and the creation of new Pacific export routes signaled a clear intent to diversify markets, not isolate others. Canada's move was not rooted in ideology but in pragmatism. The goal was to build optionality into its economic future so that no single partner could unilaterally apply pressure without consequence. This approach contrasts sharply with Trump's use of tariffs, which were often presented as displays of dominance but lacked coherent long-term planning. While tariffs might generate short-term leverage, they can also create distrust, forcing allies to prepare for the worst rather than cooperate in good faith. In the case of Canada, the result was not submission but independence. The implications of this episode for U.S. foreign and economic policy are significant. If America continues to use economic tools primarily as instruments of coercion, it risks driving even its closest allies toward diversification, regional self-reliance, and alternative institutions. Economic leadership in the 21st century will not be defined by how loudly a country demands loyalty, but by how dependably it provides stability. The erosion of American trustworthiness as a trading partner weakens its ability to shape global norms. When partners begin to build parallel systems to reduce their exposure to the U.S., they also become less likely to align with American strategic interests. Over time, this reduces the diplomatic capital the United States can draw upon in moments of crisis. By contrast, Canada's actions show that trust restraint and domestic investment can be powerful tools of foreign policy. Strategic silence, when paired with institutional resilience, can become a deterrent more effective than retaliation. This is not only a lesson for smaller powers. It is a model that larger nations can follow when they choose stability over spectacle. The confrontation between Donald Trump and Canada in 2025 revealed more than a dispute over tariffs. It exposed the mechanics of modern power. It showed how a middle power like Canada could use resource-leveraged domestic policy and supply chain discipline to defend its interests without provoking escalation. It also illustrated how erratic trade policy driven by political calculation rather than economic strategy can undermine the very people it claims to protect. American farmers, steelworkers, and consumers bore the brunt of a policy that disregarded the complexity of international interdependence. In an age of multipolar trade and fragile supply networks, quiet realignment may become the most powerful strategy of all. Canada did not shout. It did not retaliate with anger. It simply adjusted its course methodically, deliberately, and effectively. The United States may still be a superpower, but in this case it was Canada that acted like one. In 2025, former U.S. President Donald Trump reignited his signature approach to economic nationalism by imposing a sweeping 35% tariff on Canadian imports. His intention was clear: to assert American strength and protect domestic industries. But the result was not dominance. It was a revealing display of how fragile American supply chains had become. This episode delivered a crucial lesson to the world in modern geopolitics. Power no longer lies solely in weapons or volume of speech, but in control of key resources, strategic restraint, and structural resilience. The most potent symbol of this new power dynamic was not oil, steel, or weapons, it was dirt. More precisely, potash. Canada controls 38% of the world's potash supply, a mineral essential for making fertilizers that sustain global agriculture. The United States, in contrast, produces less than 10% of what it consumes. This dependency turned the U.S. from a superpower to a vulnerable client in the span of one executive order. Rather than respond with fire and fury, Canada chose discipline. Prime Minister Mark Carney did not counter with matching tariffs or fiery rhetoric. He paused the country's digital tax policy to signal diplomatic openness while quietly preparing to reduce potash exports to the United States. It was a calm, calculated move. Canada understood that in today's economy, soft power wielded with precision is often more damaging than overt confrontation. Carney's administration